Canada just pulled off a quiet economic revolution in the wheat industry, and most Americans didn't notice until their grocery bills started climbing. In the past year, we've dramatically redirected our wheat exports away from the United States in response to Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies, leaving American mills scrambling and consumers facing higher prices for bread, pasta, and baked goods. Here's what happened. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, he immediately imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian wheat, citing national security concerns and trade imbalances. Prime Minister Mark Carney faced a choice: beg for exemptions, negotiate concessions, or do something completely different. He chose option 3. Instead of fighting the tariff, he accelerated a long-term diversification strategy, pivoting millions of bushels of high-protein spring wheat and durum to eager buyers in Mexico, China, Brazil, and beyond. The numbers tell the story. Canada supplies roughly 90% of U.S. wheat imports, specifically the premium varieties that American domestic production can't easily replace. We're talking about high-protein spring wheat from Saskatchewan with protein levels around 14%, and durum from Manitoba producing 5.4 million tons annually. This isn't commodity wheat. This is the specialized grain that makes premium pasta hold its shape and bread rise perfectly. U.S. flour mills have spent decades calibrating their equipment and blends around Canadian wheat. You can't just swap it out for lower-quality domestic alternatives and get the same product. Since early 2025, U.S. flour prices have climbed 11% in some periods. Bread and pasta costs are following the same trajectory. American mills are caught in a bind: either absorb the 25% tariff hit and watch their margins evaporate, or pass the costs on to consumers who are already dealing with inflation. That tariff is costing them nearly $196 million annually, on top of the $784 million they were already paying for the wheat itself. Meanwhile, Canadian wheat is flowing to new markets. In mid-2025, Canadian Pacific Kansas City Rail celebrated unit trains hauling Manitoba wheat straight to Mexico City, rolling right through American territory without stopping to unload a single bushel. Carney attended that event and called it proof Canada has options. China followed with agreements lowering barriers on Canadian wheat after Carney's Beijing visit, where he met President Xi Jinping. Brazil and other South American markets ramped up purchases. By early 2026, non-U.S. exports had surged dramatically. So why did this happen? Politically, Trump's America First approach treated wheat as leverage in broader negotiations. He wanted concessions on dairy access, digital services taxes, and other issues. He kept floating the idea of Canada as a potential 51st state. Carney rejected these demands outright, viewing deeper U.S. integration as a vulnerability that had become a liability. The wheat pivot was about sovereignty, proving Canada has options beyond submission to American pressure. Economically, the decision made sense because global demand created immediate opportunities. China imports 10 million tons of wheat yearly and needs reliable suppliers. Mexico needs steady supply without political drama. Brazil wants quality alternatives to Argentina. These markets weren't threatening us or demanding we dismantle our domestic policies. They just wanted to buy wheat at fair prices. The Canadian government supported this pivot with trade missions, logistics improvements, and incentives to prioritize reliable trading partners over volatile ones. Carney set a goal in October 2025 to double non-U.S. wheat exports over the next decade. At the current pace, we're going to hit that target in half the time. Canada produced a record 36 million tons of wheat in 2025, and we're now exporting to over 60 countries. From the U.S. side, Trump and agricultural lobbies defend the tariffs as protecting domestic farmers from unfair competition. Trump has argued that Canada exploits the system, with threats of 100% duties if we deepen China ties. Industry groups like the American Farm Bureau warn about broader risks to U.S. agricultural exports, $60 billion worth of trade to Canada and Mexico combined, but maintain that tariffs boost domestic margins. Here's the interesting part. There's been no major tariff rollback. Enforcement has quietly softened amid intense lobbying from millers and bakers facing consumer backlash over rising prices. But Trump won't publicly admit the policy failed. White House statements frame it as negotiation leverage for the USMCA review scheduled for July 2026. The problem with that framing is that leverage only works if the other side is desperate. Canadian farmers aren't desperate. They're selling record volumes to markets that actually want stable partnerships. Canadian public sentiment shows strong support for this strategy. On social media, people are praising Carney's calm redirection. Posts highlight how the tariffs backfired, wheat flowing to Asia, Latin America, and Africa instead of South, while U.S. consumers pay more for basic staples. There's some frustration in rural areas over short-term adjustments, but overall, Canadians express pride that we have options beyond the United States. The common refrain, Trump thought we'd fold. Now American bread prices are rising while we sell globally. In the United States, there's growing concern among farmers and consumers about supply shocks, though some blame Canada or China rather than acknowledging that Trump's tariff created the problem. This isn't new territory. Canada-US agricultural disputes have deep historical roots: softwood lumber battles dating to the 1980s, canola trade fights, ongoing dairy wars. The pattern is consistent. US economic nationalism clashes with Canada's export-dependent economy, and we're forced to diversify. We've seen this with lumber pivoting to Asia, canola expanding into European markets. But the wheat pivot is happening faster and at larger scale than previous diversifications. Where does this go? Agricultural experts predict sustained redirection. The best-case scenario for Canada is that non-US wheat exports double by 2035, stabilizing farm income and dramatically reducing our vulnerability to American political volatility. We build permanent infrastructure serving global markets, upgraded ports, rail capacity, trade relationships that aren't subject to Trump's Twitter moods. Canadian farmers gain stable revenue streams that aren't threatened every time there's a US election. The worst-case scenario is that Trump follows through on 100% tariff threats, either on wheat specifically or all Canadian goods. That would disrupt new supply chains we're building, though global demand is strong enough that it would cushion the blow. US consumers would face catastrophic price increases, bread and pasta becoming luxury items. What should you watch for? The USMCA review deadline in July 2026 is critical. Watch the U.S. midterm elections in November 2026, which could moderate Trump's position if Republicans fear losing seats over grocery prices. Monitor wheat futures markets for volatility that signals supply chain stress. The consequences of this pivot are profound. For Canadian sovereignty, this is a major win. Reducing U.S. dependency from 80 to 90% of wheat exports to potentially under 50% gives Ottawa real leverage in negotiations. We're no longer vulnerable to threats like, accept our terms or your farmers go bankrupt. We can walk away because we have buyers lined up. Economically, Canadian farmers are adapting well. The short-term loss of some U.S. sales hurt rural prairie communities, but new markets are absorbing the supply. Government support programs have eased the transition costs. Long-term diversification means more stable income streams less vulnerable to political disruption. For the United States, the consequences are hitting hard. Flour prices up 11% directly impacts every American household. Bread, pasta, baked goods, these are staples, not luxuries. Adding thousands of dollars annually to grocery bills amid existing inflation creates real political pressure. The Canada-US relationship strains further, complicating cooperation on food security and agricultural research. For you personally as a Canadian, this means more stable domestic food prices because our agricultural sector isn't trapped in a one-sided relationship. If you work in agriculture or logistics, there are new export-related jobs emerging. If you're in rural communities that historically depended on U.S. sales, the adjustment has been difficult, but government programs are available. Here's what I think about all of this. Trump weaponized trade, expecting Canada would submit because we always have before. But Carney turned it into an opportunity, proving that our wheat, our farms, and our economic future aren't bargaining chips. We've rerouted our harvest to partners who value reliability over political theatrics. American families are now paying the price for their president's ego, literally paying more every time they buy bread or pasta. How long before U.S. consumers demand change when basic staples become luxuries? Stay tuned as this story develops. Canada's strength grows when we choose independence over intimidation.